Thanks so much for being here. We have such an amazing panel today to talk about generative AI and music. So many different viewpoints represented here. So like an amazing Grammy-winning songwriter for Dua Lipa and Lizzo. This is Emily. Alex from the Chainsmokers, but also an investor. Ed from Stability AI and Meng from BandLab. So excited to get started. I thought we could just start with a question for everyone and kind of go down the line, maybe starting here. Like, what are you seeing, just to set the stage, what are you seeing generative AI being used for in music creation right now? And then how do you think it could change in the next few years? I want to start with Ed because I think you have the most years of experience of this, because in 2010, you started a company that was already using generative AI in music called Jukedeck. Is that
yeah,
right?
we were about a decade
what could it do then, and how? I'm sure it's really different now. Like,
yeah, sure. So I mean, back then it could do very little. My first generative music system that I wrote was really simple. I remember the first time I heard it output what was basically a quite bad-sounding hymn tune, and I was absolutely thrilled with what it could do. It's come a long way.
Him, like, right, you write choral music.
Sorry, him, like, yeah, sorry, that's a British choral thing. Yeah, but I mean, so it's come a very long way. I mean, I think where we are now is I'm very excited about areas like musical inspiration. I think that actually, you know, one of the real benefits, and there are downsides as well, but one of the real benefits to generative AI can be inspiring people, can be giving you ideas. When I sit down to write a song at the piano, if I'm honest, my kind of fingers fall to the same chords again and again, and actually generating some new ideas, I think, is a really cool thing. But I'm very, very excited about it in education. I think that personalizing music education, which can be quite elitist otherwise, I think is a really exciting area. So yeah, there's some of the areas I'm excited about. And
then how do you think it could change in the next few years? Like, do you think it's going to change at a more rapid pace, or what that look like? Yeah,
I mean, I think at the moment, you know, generative music is obviously a little behind sort of generative image and maybe some other domains like text. But I think it's going to get, you know, it's already pretty good, and I think it's going to get better very rapidly. You know, I think you'll see the same kind of trajectory in images where, you know, Midjourney V1 was, you know, sort of, you'd use it and it'd be fun, but it wouldn't really work that well, whereas Midjourney now is like photorealistic. And I think you'll see the same in music over the next 1 or 2 years.
Okay, Meng, how about you? Can you describe what SongStarter does, or like,
yeah, sure.
How does it incorporate AI?
Absolutely. So when we think about AI and the powers of generative AI, we obviously at BandLab think about it. You know, we're a tech company in some you know, scenes and the way that people think of us, but actually we're very much a music company and artists first in the things that we do. And so we see AI and generative AI and this phase that we're in, and we think of it as a phase change of this moment of generative AI as really something that is quite fundamental. It's obviously a huge opportunity empowering people, but also something in which, you know, we've been particularly thoughtful about in how you need to protect human creators, especially with that as the focus of our company. So some of the possibilities of what's actually out there when it comes to generative AI, breaking down the barriers, empowering people who, again, music education that some of us take for granted in places around the world, other countries don't necessarily have the same actual social systems or the art systems that we have in first world countries. And so actually building the gap and bridging the gap on people who don't know what a chord is or a scale is and things like that, you know, to actually allow them to have the tools to songwrite is something where I think generative AI is part of what potentially bridges the gap in education, creates a lot more opportunity for people, but there are things we have to be very thoughtful of around training of models, around the idea of what does it mean for copyright and how to think about it thoughtfully to protect the existing ecosystem that is music.
And your tool right now only makes short clips, and it only uses like licensed music, or?
Yes, exactly. So when you think, so we have a feature on BandLab called SongStarter. So BandLab is a tool of which one of the features that we have, we're a social network, a social creation platform that, you know, over 60 million, that's our public number, over 60 million registered users around the world, and tools for them to make music like traditional DAWs and tools that you may use on your mobile phone. So one of our features is called SongStarter, but again, there's a reason we call it SongStarter and not Song Finisher. It's very much the idea that prompting people and actually being part of that creative process ultimately to empower humans is the core of it. And yeah, you know, I think the beautiful thing about music, although it's slightly further behind, like Ed was saying, it can be based on musicology. There are notes to a scale, there are different harmonies and harmonic progressions that actually make sense musically, plus also the ability to actually commission licensed works and things that you can actually use to train your models with. And we feel very strongly about this, which is why aligning with the Human Artistry campaign was an important thing for us to do as BandLab as well.
And Alex, I mean, you kind of have two major hats here, right? Like you're a performer, you're a musician, and you're also an investor. Sometimes in these companies that are making tools around music, around AI, like what are you seeing now? And based on what you're seeing now, what do you think, how do you think your job could be different in a few years, like in terms of music creation using AI?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, I think, if you look back kind of over the evolution of music production, we had these big soundboards and you bring in live musicians and, track a song, and it would take, weeks or months potentially. And then, with the advancement of the personal computer, we kind of got into DAWs and Ableton and Pro Tools and FL Studio that, it created more efficiencies and kind of enhanced the experience of what one producer was able to do. And I think that was really powerful. I mean, that's how Drew and I started. We were like in the box producers, producing in our bedroom. We didn't have, the ability to produce out of a large studio. So we loved these plugins like Cthulhu, which I was a very advanced piano player, and it allowed me the opportunity to create chords that, we would have never been able to. I do think for us, as we kind of move forward in time, it's exciting. I mean, we've been using these tools in some of our, productions already. But I think, long and hard about just the importance of the human role in the loop and just like what music means to people. I think we tread an interesting space being kind of electronic producers where sometimes the vocals and the storytelling is really just melody and sounds. And there's other genres like, gospel and songwriting, more songwriting focused genres that Emily is a pioneer of that, I think it's a little less, it's scary for them to have, AI creating lyrics and cutting back on some of the, authenticity and creative liberties that, make songwriting so important to the people that listen to music. So it's kind of scary. I mean, I'm really excited as an investor. I'm also excited as a, musician producer. But, for me, I think we look at it more as just like, how do we get more out of less? But, never lose sight of the authenticity and kind of individualism that like music expresses.
And Emily, I know you had mentioned like you have less exposure to it. You've seen people like share demos with like AI generated voice in them, but like from where you're sitting. Oh, and to be clear, also Emily has written songs for the Chainsmokers. Like these two know each other very well. Like from where you're sitting, like is it coming up in is like generative AI coming up in your daily life, or is it like it still feels pretty far away?
Yeah, I have learned more just in talking to you guys in the last hour than I've known about AI at all. People have pulled up ChatGPT in sessions and kind of just more in like a experimental, like, write a song in the style of the Chainsmokers that Emily Warren would write and just like see what it comes up with. And it hasn't felt that threatening yet. That being said, in the last few things that have been said here, I've been thinking about how accessibility has already kind of ruined music, in my opinion. And I'm like, I'm coming from a purist. Like, I love the process of sitting and struggling, and I genuinely love that. And so even like seeing people being able to switch out of like having to hire musicians into like using a computer, which is amazing that so many more people can access it, has meant that like that many more hundreds of thousands of songs are coming out, and they're not just coming out because they're like amazing songs, but a lot of them come out just like because they can come out. And that has made music, I mean, we were just bitching about the Grammy nominations because there's not that many amazing things coming out right now to choose from, because it's become so much more about like how many attempts at a single can we cram into one album, and how quick can we get it out for more people to listen to and try it. And guess what, if we don't like it, we'll just put another one out next week. So that has kind of already torched music, in my opinion. And yeah, I think it is a little scary. Like I get wanting tools to help you not get stuck. I think getting stuck and getting bored is like what makes us human and what makes us connect with people and use our brains. And I think if we start letting other things think for us so we don't have to struggle at all, like we'll stop being creative and just be more like capitalism robots putting as many songs out as possible. So that's my opinion.
Well, I think this brings me to an interesting question I've always wondered about is like, I think a lot of the uses we've seen of generative AI now is like they repeat things and remix things that we already have. And yet you could also maybe tell them like actually do something a little out of the box, and maybe it would. Like if we end up using more of these tools in music creation, what kind of music is it going to get made? Is it going to sound like everything else, or will it actually sound different? Like, maybe I'll toss to Ed first. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll probably do both. I mean, I think, clearly these kinds of models can, and in all modalities, not just in music, but can kind of generate things in sort of the styles that they're trained on. But, it's also clear, I think, that they can do new and surprising things. I mean, music models can fuse genres if you ask them to. For instance, we had just one of our internal researchers, and before we were releasing our model, tried prompting the model, and I think he said, "I want a drum beat. I want a drum beat hammering wood at 120 BPM," and it kind of took the sound of a hammer, but then just like made this kind of weird drum beat out of it, and it's kind of, and that's one of the big things that Stable Audio that we made. For clarity, I'm not actually at Stability anymore, but Stable Audio that we made, that's one of the main things it was used for, like sample creation. But I think if you go back all the way to like 2016 and AlphaGo and the kind of Go playing AI from DeepMind and what that achieved even back then, I think you saw a surprise from human experts in what it could do. There was this one very famous move that everyone in the room will know, that really just like totally flummoxed Lee Sedol, one of the world's leading Go players, and and asked about it. Just sort of said, well, it was an amazing move and like nothing I've ever seen before. And people after this sort of said, well, maybe it'll teach me new things about how to play Go. So I mean, again, like whether or not that's a good thing, I think the jury is out. But I think we will see both, surprise from these systems and recreating, sort of existing styles. I think you'll see both, basically.
It's exciting because I think you're right. You're going to see opportunities, like Ed said, where you have these moments of clarity that maybe no one would have arrived at before. But I also agree with Emily that it's just going to be an onslaught of like a lot of crap. Democratization of anything is kind of a good thing. Like I love the idea that more kids can make music and experiment with things and add audio to videos they make in their backyard. And I think that's critically important. And then as like a pro musician on our end, I've actually been surprised at like the lack of tooling that's been kind of created for people like us in terms of the quality and the outputs. But I love the idea, it's like everything just evolves forward. I mean, it's kind of like inevitable in some ways. And I think just from seeing what's happened in society, it is sad to kind of see some of the human element lost, of course. But it's just kind of this inevitable push forward that we've seen over the course of generations of music. And, I do think there are pieces that, maybe are less important and we shouldn't focus on so much, like the songwriting piece. Like, do we really want like, AI generated lyrics versus like, hey, a tool that can mix a song to the exact same specifications of another song that I'm super fond of and I want to, sonically sound in the same frequency. That sounds like a very cool use of this technology in an interesting way. I'd love to do like one of those, research tests where like we're all at a beach club having a good time, listening to music we know and music we don't know. And then over the course, you're like voting on each song, like, is this an AI song or not? And would you enjoy it if it was? And I think, when this is AI generated, you're gonna feel a certain type of way versus like if you just went in and heard like a great house record that was generated by, ChatGPT or whatever, or Soundry or, any of these, great platforms, I don't know if you would care. You just kind of be like, it was good, I liked it. And I think like that Ghostwriter song by Drake, you get into all sorts of legality reasons and different things that we discussed on our call too, but it wasn't bad, at the end of the day.
I think, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure the Ghostwriter song, it was like written by that
songwriter.
guy. Yeah, he's like a songwriter who wrote it, and then he used AI to like insert the voice.
Exactly, so it's probably less about like the authenticity of songwriting and more about like just the ownership of someone's likeness.
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting point because actually, if people go back, there was someone who, back what they called fake Jay-Z. I think a lot of people forget there was an artist who sounded a lot like Jay-Z and wrote original music and just sounded like him. And then there was a question of imitation and whether it was sort of impersonation. I think with the AI track, it was very interesting because it was originally written as just was made to sound more familiar through the voice, right?
Yeah,
and I think controversially with the training of a model that if to all intents and purposes, he'd use his own voice, would have been potentially an original track. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of music coming through, and I think there's definitely a question of volume and the challenges that creates, because today, the issue in music for artists coming through is not distribution anymore, it's differentiation, right? Every single artist today, new and even old, is not just competing with the artists of their current generation, they're competing with every single great artist of every generation before. If you put something on Spotify, you're competing with Taylor Swift and Ed Sheeran and the Chainsmokers and all the great artists that you guys have collaborated with, as well as Beethoven and Bach and everyone throughout history. So, even stepping back from the Gen AI conversation and the challenges with volume of music and creativity on a global scale, if you forget AI for a second, this move to mobile creation, which is where BandLab has really come in, we take for granted in first world countries because we own iPhones or we have access to tools like that, where if you said, hey, I want to make music for free and I want an app to make it on my phone, you just say, well, maybe use GarageBand. But depending on what stats you look at, 70 to 80% of the world uses Android. And we know that the accessibility of desktop devices, for example, in places around the world in developing countries is much, much, much lower. So there are literally billions of people around the world who don't have access to music making, even before education, without tools like BandLab and some of the things that potentially could empower the next generation. So, places like FL Studio, that was very accessible, that's kind of what's happening with the new generation. And I think, yes, there will be a lot more crap, subjectively of how I play guitar. So it's kind of sad to have put so many hours in, built the calluses on the hand, and then, someone could just use a loop, for example, and just play something musically with a guitar loop. But there are also going to be a lot of incredible new artists and amazing sounds that come out because people are trying to differentiate themselves from the noise or potentially the AI noise that comes out of this moment that we're in.
I have a question. How do you then, though, cap it at, giving access to people who wouldn't have it otherwise, and then entering people who have access but are using it to be lazy?
Laziness as in, let me ask you a question back so I answer the
Please.
question. Lazy, well, to the point of technology empowering the creation, the creativity, and the artist, right? I think ultimately it depends on the vision and the goal. If we're talking about helping an artist express their creativity, I look at AI and Gen AI and the prompts or some of the possibilities with AI empowering the process. It's all just technology if you go back in time. A guitar was tech at some point in time. Copyright as an institution was technology, still is technology. Notation was technology. And actually, auto-tune, for example, and some great algorithms were ways of, I would argue, being lazier to not be a great singer, and you could use it, but obviously people have used it musically. So I think it's a very fine line between, there are obviously workflow optimizations that are possible, that I think as long as that's empowering the human, that's very valuable. But sometimes those workflow automations actually end up creating new possibilities and new optimizations. I think it's very hard to draw a line, but I think the optimism is in that we have limited people who will consume that art. And in some ways, we have the time and the attention that we spend. So the consumer has to make the choice ultimately, but I think there is it's really hard to draw the line. It's a serious question of, is someone who uses autotune lesser of an artist than someone who doesn't? And is someone who uses a loop or records a guitar loop and plays it back to make the song consistent to that sound, are they just being lazy to not record it live? Right? I think it's a very interesting question that has occurred for over a decade or 2 decades.
Yeah, I mean, part of what you do is really write songs that then get sent to other artists that sing about stories that are personal and dear to you, and it's kind of interesting, I guess, to your point. It's really subjective choice by each individual, which is what attracts you to music? Is it the storytelling? Is it the personal experience? Is it just the sonic melodies and sounds that someone's put together? I mean, autotune's a big part of our process, but look at someone like T-Pain, who laid a whole career off of kind of leveraging that sound in an amazing way.
Yeah, it became their instrument. And it's funny because I'm more of an acoustic guitarist personally, I'm terrible at recording to a click. So part of the recording process, sometimes you record to a click, so everything's in time. I'm terrible at that, right? So rubato is sort of the, you sort of move in speed. But actually, for me, recording and then playing back a sample has always felt a bit dead and a bit lifeless compared to something that feels live with vocals recorded. So, I know exactly what you're saying, and there's a question of what is the shortcut? And you can see the benefits of doing that because you could actually instrument to it and program MIDI to it, but it does change the life and the feel, artistically.
I do want to add, though, that I do think Emily's point is very fair, that, and maybe I would characterize it by the fact that many of today's state-of-the-art generative AI models, while the generative AI companies will sort of generally say, hey, this is assistive technology for creators. Realistically, the same model that can assist creators can ultimately replace creators as well. The difference between this and something like auto-tune is that this can and will be able to, like very soon in music, like write an entire song that is basically, write and produce an entire song that's pretty good. And I think that's a very, very different situation to be in than something like auto-tune, where it replaces certain things, but it ultimately can be used in that creative way and can kind of only be used in that creative way. So yeah, I mean, I do think the point is fair and it's worth considering.
Yeah, I would say, topics I really wanted to touch on: replacement and copyright. Let's talk about copyright just for a minute. Ed, you left Stability last week for reasons related to this. Can you tell us a little about what your thought process was?
Yeah, so I was VP of Audio Stability AI, and had actually a really good time there. And people are very thoughtful about these issues at Stability, which is great. I've always been very passionate about training models trained kind of consensually, where the training data is consensually provided by rights holders, because I think otherwise it's kind of exploitative and probably not kind of fair use. And so we did that on the audio side, which was really nice. We released this model called Stable Audio, which was trained on licensed data, shared revenue with rights holders. But that in general is not Stability's opinion, I think. Stability recently filed a response to the US Copyright Office put out this kind of call for opinions on AI and copyright, and many companies submitted responses, and Stability was one of those, and Stability kind of said, well, we think that training generative AI models in this way is fair use. And to be fair, like lots of AI companies think that and say that. Lots of the responses said that, so it's not just Stability. In a way, I wasn't really resigning from Stability, I was resigning from a whole group of companies. But that, to me, that just doesn't sit very well. And I think that it's kind of a critical time for creators and songwriters and people outside of just music as well. And I think there's a big conversation to be had. Fundamentally, I just don't think that's fair use. I don't see how you can argue it is.
Why do you think more people in AI don't share the same opinion?
Because it's probably going to be really expensive, and to be fair, I do think I've had lots of conversations about this with people, and I think that sensible people disagree on this. Fair use is, fair use was not the concept of fair use was not created with this in mind, right? You can interpret fair use. I mean, for me, there are four things that Congress think come into a decision on whether use of copyright or use of a copyrighted material is fair use. The fourth is, what is the effect on the original work of your use of the copyrighted material? And that, for me, is probably why AI companies focus on the assistive benefits, but not the replacement benefits. Because as soon as you think, not the replacement benefits, replacement isn't a benefit. As soon as you think about like the replacement of creators, you start to kind of ask, well, what is the effect on the market for the original work? And that is my main concern. So look, I don't know. I don't know how many people in AI companies really think like this, but I think that it's licensing is like relatively hard. We had to license all our data for Stable Audio. It takes effort, right? It's work.
Yeah, I think what I'd say is, speaking as a company that has AI and in the music space, I think I would completely agree. And actually, I think there is genuinely a real risk of displacement and replacement of creators, and the impact of that on the ecosystem has to be very, very thoughtfully considered. And I think, to your point, I think a lot of it is actually financial incentives, right, for some companies, and not necessarily that the financial incentives are there for them to respect the institution of copyright, which I think is incredibly important, that has been built over hundreds of years, and the regulation and the policy has to evolve. That's the one thing we know for sure. As technology always gets older, policy and regulation or new technologies come out, they have to evolve. So I'm personally pretty optimistic about the whole thing, especially for people on the stage or people in the music industry right now. I think that every phase change, there is a question, does it disappear or does it grow? And I think music, if we go back to the last time and we think historically of technology, the last time there was this huge moment of a technological innovation, a new medium, potentially the idea of human displacement and replacement, it was actually the invention of the phonograph. Right? If you look back at that moment, everyone then, if you wiped our brains with all hindsight, would have been worried, crap, the entire industry is going to be destroyed because we're all live musicians and no one's going to need to go to live music anymore. We're just going to put these things on and they're going to play and replace all live musicians. We couldn't have imagined, the Rolling Stones, the Billboards, the MTVs of the world, the incredible record industry, publishing rights as a derivative asset that people can invest in financially. That all exists because of some of the democratization that's happened in music, because of copyright. That happened before. I'm optimistic it can happen again, and that what's on the other side is incredibly large. But I think we have to be incredibly thoughtful about policy, rights around copyright and legislation. Otherwise, there is a real risk that the ecosystem gets destroyed and creativity gets demolished. And actually the people who suffer the most are not the people necessarily at the very top and have established credits and things like that. It's actually the kid from South Africa in a township or someone in Indonesia in a village who's never had the chance before and will never get the chance of that class or asset mobility because legislation maybe didn't happen correctly.
Great. We'll check back in 10 years and reconvene and see how everyone's predictions panned out. Thank you so much. This was really fun, and appreciate all of your time.
Thank you so much.
Silicon Valley. Goodbye. Silicon Valley. Goodbye.